And hello, fabulous AP students. This is Mr. Jacobson. I'm excited to be with you today. This is the first webcast where we are officially starting now at 1200. So we have not. We're done with the pre 1200. We are now starting where all this stuff from now on can be asked on the AP exam, and you definitely need to know. So please pay attention and let's get into the song Dynasty and understand why it's important. So first off, here we go. Okay, first off, here's a timeline, and you don't need to know all that. You don't even need to know 90% of this stuff. But what I really want you to know is that the song Dynasty, it starts at 960 CE and it ends towards 1279. Now we are jumping in with the AP curriculum around 1200, but just understand that just because at 1200 doesn't mean the song Dynasty began. It's been going on for over 200 years. So a lot is happening when we kind of get to 1200 and start hitting the ground running. Not to mention, eventually the Mongolians will conquer the Song Dynasty around 1279. So anyway, so we're going to look at the Song Dynasty, and we're going to do this through the social theme. So what are some social themes? What are some aspects of how society looked socially in the Song Dynasty? The first thing you need to know is that a whole nother class system emerges in the Song Dynasty, and this happens because of the civil service examination. So you have all these families who are putting money into educating their children, their young boys, right? And then those boys are becoming more and more educated, whether they pass the exam or not, the civil service exam, so they can work in government. They're becoming more educated. And so the more education these boys receive and the more boys who become educated, the more strength in numbers there becomes, and slowly you have this new class of people known as the scholarly gentry. And here's a picture of like what a scholarly gentry man would look like. Um, doesn't look like a warrior, wearing, cloth. He has that hat that has the two flaps coming out the side. I'm sure there's a name for it. I don't know what that name officially is, but I'm sure somebody could tell me maybe. Um, but they start becoming a very popular and a bigger and bigger class, because the more people who become educated and pass the civil service exam and go into government, we have more strength in numbers, and they start competing with the really wealthy landowners as well. So we have the scholarly gentry that comes about. We also have foot binding, which we talked about before. Foot binding comes from Confucian ideas, and it was done so that these in the Song Dynasty. I need to make sure you guys understand is that foot binding is mainly an elite or in aristocratic families. It will become more mainstream like in the Qing dynasty, many dynasties later, but for now it's just aristocracy that foot bind their girls, and that's done so that their girls can be married and can go off and continue and find someone to marry and become a wife to. So here we have under political. So what are we looking at politically in the theme or the lens of the Song Dynasty? So first we have the civil service examination. Since the government adopted Confucianism, the Song Dynasty continued to practice the allowing the best and the brightest into government positions by proving themselves on the exam. So the civil service examination, it continues. It happened in the Tang Dynasty, which happened before the Song, but only the wealthy could do it. By the time you get to the Song Dynasty, you have Emperor Tezu, who's like, you know what? Let's try to make this more so everybody will have a chance to take this. If there's a poor boy who's pretty dang intelligent, I want him in government if he could pass that exam over a rich, spoiled kid. So this idea that not just the elite could take the civil service examination made the Song Dynasty into what we call a meritocracy or meristocracy. And that means that it truly was based on merit and not really position in your family and what you were born to as to whether you would be able to succeed. So this was very important. It also, every time somebody would pass the exam, they would go into government. So then government would start becoming bigger and bigger and bigger in the Song Dynasty. So we have this idea of Chinese imperial bureaucracy, which is this vast organization of government workers. And so obviously there's good and bad that come with that, and we can even talk about that later in class. So let's talk about economically. So in the Song Dynasty, um, they extend the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal was built in other dynasties, but they'll extend it. And this Grand Canal is going to go about 30,000 miles. It's going to connect multiple rivers. If you look at this over here, this map, you can see that it connects all these rivers. As you can see it going down and it's crossing. This is the Yellow River. This is the Yangtze or the Changjiang. And so it's this canal that was created through government, a lot of government blood, sweat, and tears by people who were working on projects. Um, and they connected all these rivers together, and this made a very prosperous trading region for China because now you could transport goods through waterways, which made it cheaper, and you can travel more abundant goods this way as well. So China is going to become an economic powerhouse due to this Grand Canal. Another reason why China really flourishes during this time period is something called champa rice. So this is a rice strain that they discovered in Vietnam. And the great thing about this rice is that it was drought resistant, meaning that it didn't need as much water to be able to grow as the other kind of rice. And to top it off, this rice would give you a double yield each year, meaning that instead of just having one harvest per year, this rice strain could give you a harvest in December and then also one in the summertime as well. So you would get a double portion of a it's where I'm looking for of agricultural food to be able to support the China. And you should know by now, the more food that's available, the more population goes up. So China is going to see a major jump in population because there's so much food due to this new strain of rice which they found in modern day Vietnam. Another thing that's going to increase China is going to be the tributary system. So the tributary system is this attitude, and the three countries or civilizations, if you will, that are most known for being a part of this tributary system is Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Okay, and what you had to do is you had to acknowledge that China was superior compared to your civilization. And then if you did that, and by sending gifts and presents and schmoozing the Chinese emperor, you could actually get the right to trade with China. And because China had such a flourishing economy, I mean, they have discovered things like the magnetic compass, gunpowder, silk, porcelain, all these rare, beautiful luxury type goods. Uh, it was just, it was too hard a thing to not pass up to trade with China. However, you had to acknowledge their superiority, and by doing that came consequences, especially if you were like Korea or Vietnam, who bordered China, which we'll talk about that later. So tributary systems were in place, made China very economically strong. It reinforced their political prowess within that region, and many of the people um, who did offer tribute to China had to kowtow to the emperor, which was a face down plant, basically showing complete submission. Okay, so some of the technologies we need to be aware of, and gunpowder wasn't discovered in the Song Dynasty, but they're going to discover implements like like a gun, a way to make the gunpowder project something out, and you can use it as a weapon. So they're going to start seeing gunpowder weapons being used during the Song Dynasty more. Also, printing is going to become a really big deal. So in the Tang Dynasty, before the Song, okay, there was woodblock printing that was created. And then in the Song Dynasty, they're going to move into an even more efficient way called movable type printing, which are these little things here. So here, these are uh, tiles that they've made from clay, and his name was Bi Sheng, who was the inventor. And you could just in essence put these Chinese characters in a row to form words and sentences and eventually paragraphs, and it was much easier, and it's very similar to what Gutenberg is going to use, the same type of system. In fact, this idea of printing, movable type printing, is going to travel all across Asia, across the Silk Road. Eventually, it's going to get to Europe, where Gutenberg will eventually use it and print out the first Bible. Okay. Chinese, another invention they had was the paper money. So before this, they used coinage. And coinage is basically you have to have metal, copper, bronze, iron, silver, whatever, to be able to make that, but that could be money. Well, now they discovered, you know what? We could actually print a piece of paper and say it's worth this amount of money, and have that kind of money in reserve to support it. So they created paper money. This made it easier for merchants and other people trading to be able to, because instead of carrying a massive bag of coins that could probably get pretty heavy, you have just a stack of paper money, which still equals the same value. So this is a good thing. However, when the Song Dynasty started failing a little bit towards the end, they started printing more and more money, and they ran into inflation, which really became a disaster for them economically. So there are four great inventions of China you must absolutely know. The first one is gunpowder. The second, printing, paper, and the magnetic compass. I don't know if there's really any order, but these are the four. The order is really not important. It could go magnetic compass, gunpowder, printing, paper making. I don't think it matters. But just know that these are very important inventions that you need to be aware of. Next. Okay, now we're going to talk about Sinification. So we're going to talk about first the Sinification of Japan. The Sinification of Japan just means the Chinese influence on Japan. So Sinification means Chinese influence on and then whatever. So the Sinification of Korea would be the Chinese influence that happened on Korea. So anyway, we're going to go with Japan first. So since Japan was separated from China by a sea, this allowed Japan to have more control with their interactions and adoption of Chinese culture. Korea and Vietnam isn't going to get this kind of luxury because they're going to border China, which means they're going to have more pressure and more intimidation to become more Chinese in their everyday life. However, Japan is separated from the Sea of Japan, so they got about 500 miles away from China, which is going to make it easier for them to just sort of pick and choose what they want. So there is a prince by the name of Prince Shotoku, and he promoted Buddhism and Confucianism over the traditional Japanese religion of Shintoism. So we have a Japanese prince who is now encouraging other Japanese in Confucianism ideas to adopt them, and also Buddhism. And Buddhism's going to merge with Shintoism, which is the original traditional religion or belief of Japan, and they're going to make something called Zen Buddhism. The Heian period in Japan, they're going to emulate a lot of Chinese politics, like they're going to build their city, their capital city, after the capital city in Japan, Chang'an. Um, they're going to have writing that's going to be very Chinese, called kanji, with kanji characters. And of course, Chinese art will become very popular as well. Japan unexpectedly will break off ties with China and eventually begin a feudal system. So uh, there's a time in Japan where they just love China, love China, love China, and then at one point it just stops completely. Historians don't fully know, but shortly after that starts the feudal system with Japanese samurai, etc. Okay, here's our last slide here. This is the Sinification of Korea and Vietnam. So Korea borders China, so they are Sinified, and they are a tributary state of China. In fact, they become more Sinified than Japan or Vietnam ever was because they're so close to the main government of China. Okay. So Korean elites followed Confucianism, while the peasants gravitated more towards Buddhism. But Buddhism really becomes popular all throughout Korea, and even stays there for a long time, even today. Even um, centralized, they centralized their government in the style of Chinese. So even their government looks more Chinese. They also start offering the civil service exam. However, they do it for elites in their country and not the peasants. Therefore, it's not a true meritocracy like the Sung Dynasty was. However, all this is going on and much more that I'm just don't have time to really go over. Um, the Korea manages to still develop their own writing system that's independent from Chinese. Even today, the Korean writing system's not Chinese. It's Korean. It has very unique characters just for Korea, etc. And then Vietnam, they're also going to have a sinification process, but they're going to be a little more resistant. Um, the Vietnamese way of life is very different from Chinese. Um, so one of the things is, they're going to launch many rebellions against the Chinese to resist the sinification, but due to close proximity, unfortunately, it's just eventually going to happen. Vietnamese women had way more freedoms than Chinese women, and Vietnamese women resented that Confucian ideas are kind of taking those freedoms that they once enjoyed, including foot binding. The Vietnamese women were like, "You want me to do what with my feet? You are out of your mind." And the Vietnamese women would not foot bind. They would fight that tooth and nail. Of course, Chinese sinification is very powerful, so slowly that idea would creep in, but it never really became popular among Vietnamese society, although other Confucian ideas will. They implemented a merit-based bureaucracy where they're going to have that civil service type examination. And despite all this, and the constant resisting of Chinese sinification, in fact, they used lots of guerrilla warfare to fight back the Chinese, very similar to how we hear in Vietnam how they fought. And then, but all this, they're going to still maintain and manage to develop their own writing system independent from China as well. So the Vietnamese will resist to a degree, and they'll even create a system of writing that's unique, very similar to how the Koreans did as well. So anyway, that's pretty much it. So go ahead and write your at least one-page summary, and we'll go ahead and discuss this when we come back. And thank you.